But after a disaster, everything is chaos anyway. And there is an actual open-heartedness about sharing that isn't there all the time. That's part of the magic and the transformation that can happen. I always think a lot about myself as the Grinch. And what we're trying to do is have our little Grinchy hearts grow one little size.
Welcome to Climate Changed, a podcast from the BTS Center. Here, we ask you and our guests what it means to live, to love, and to lead in a climate-changed world. This season, we're learning from people who are reimagining what faithful, creative leadership looks like today. I'm Autumn Brown, artist, theologian, mother, and freedom worker.
And I'm Reverend Nicole Dieroff, Associate Director at the BTS Center. Together, we explore how spiritual imagination and real-world practice meet this moment of change. Today, we're talking with Katie Mears. Katie helps communities recover from and adapt to disasters.
In my conversation with Katie, we discussed the meaning of climate refugee. We considered the need for belonging and dignity during displacement. And we ask, what can faith-based communities offer when the ground beneath us is literally changing? For you listening, we'd love to hear from you. If this conversation stirs or inspires an idea or story, you can always email or leave a voice message for Nicole and me. I'll share those contact details later in the episode. Before we hear from Katie, let's take a moment to ground ourselves.
Autumn and I are bringing to you a reading from a book that we both have turned to many times over the years, a book that perhaps we might consider to be sacred scripture for us today. It is a book authored by Rebecca Solnit titled A Paradise Built in Hell.
Horrible in itself, disaster is sometimes a door back into paradise. The paradise, at least, in which we are who we hope to be, do the work we desire, and are each our sisters and brothers' keeper.
We don't even have a language for this emotion, in which the wonderful comes wrapped in the terrible, joy in sorrow, courage in fear. We cannot welcome disaster, but we can value the responses, both practical and psychological.
The map of utopias is cluttered nowadays with experiments by other names, and the very idea is expanding. It needs to open up a little more to contain disaster communities. These remarkable societies suggest that just as many machines reset themselves to their original settings after a power outage, human beings reset themselves to something altruistic, communitarian, resourceful, and imaginative after a disaster, that we revert to something we already know how to do. The possibility of paradise is already within us as a default setting.
The possibility of paradise is already within us as a default setting. That was a reading from A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit.
Katie Mears is the Senior Technical Specialist for U.S. Disaster and Climate Risk at Episcopal Relief and Development. Katie has been on the front lines of disaster response, from hurricanes to wildfires to the slow-moving crises of climate change. They've spent nearly 20 years accompanying faith communities as they prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters across the United States.
In their role with Episcopal Relief and Development, they partner with churches, volunteers, and local leaders to meet both physical and spiritual needs. Katie's work explores how disaster can reveal our interdependence and how moments of shock can become turning points for adaptation and compassion.
Before we begin, a few reflections. As you listen, notice how Katie wrestles with the language of displacement. Katie invites us to look beyond the label climate refugee to the deeper question of identity, faith, and belonging.
This conversation reminds us that disaster work isn't only about logistics. It's also about love. It's about seeing the divine in every person who has been forced to move, to rebuild, and to start again.
Let's listen. Katie, welcome to the show. It is such a pleasure to have you on the Climate Changed podcast.
Happy to be here. This is great.
My sense from your bio is that you started working in the disaster world, the disaster recovery world around the 2005, right?
Yeah, totally. I graduated college and had done some political organizing, and everybody had lost in that election cycle.
Right.
And so was sort of facing like moving to rural Kentucky to work on some random special election or coming up with a plan B. And the most important thing for that plan B was not accidentally ending up back in my parents' house and working the job I'd had since I was 15.
Yes.
When I was taking care of my cousins while their parents were gone, the priest there was leading a trip to New Orleans the day after Christmas. And I like want to say that there was some like high-minded moral reason that I called to do it, but it was like very practical. Like I needed to go back to my parents' house for Christmas, and then I needed to not accidentally stay.
Yes. Yes.
I gotta go. I gotta go to New Orleans.
Wow.
We were cleaning out houses of people whose homes had flooded. I eventually joined staff a couple months after I was there. And part of what was so striking was that, sort of unlike the political work that I had done, basically, no matter who was in town volunteering, nobody liked it when little old ladies were crying. You could have the most conservative church folks from South Carolina with Marriage Matters bumper stickers, and then a whole crew of queers from Boston, Unitarians. And they work together because like we disagree on everything, but like this lady needed her house cleaned out and we wanted to do that with dignity. And we all were on board with that. That was enormously transformative, especially coming out of electoral work. We were finding real common ground in ways that you felt like you were making a little difference, both for that particular person, but also in the hearts of the volunteers who hadn't necessarily seen the humanity in each other. It was great. And so it let me have space to like get out of from being the arguer in the corner to actually like in the room in all those car rides around town.
Right. And all of the ways that I think ideally the benefit of spiritual practice, right, is that it supports you to be with uncertainty, to be with uncertainty. It is so formative when you encounter someone who's ahead of you in their spiritual journey, whether it's because of age or just, practice, who can model that, the ability to be with their whatever their spiritual orientation is as a practice for uncertainty, which feels very relevant to the time that we're in.
Here we are.
Uncertainty, the threshold crossing, the transition. So I wanted to ask you how you understand the work of spiritual leadership or this like chaplaincy framework in the context of a climate changed world, and particularly what ways you have found yourself over the last 20 years really engaging in this kind of offering of care, accompaniment, and spiritual grounding inside of situations where you are very aware of the intersection between the disaster and the ecological disruption that is also co-occurring or maybe is the cause.
I think that one of the real gifts of being in the Episcopal space is that, and again, we're certainly not alone in this, but we're really comfortable both in faith spaces, but also in science spaces. There's just a lot of openness because we're not a tradition that thinks that God made fossils to trick us. Like there's a lot of science in the room when there's a lot of us gathered.
Church is like the church of the nerd.
I mean, not the only nerd, but there's a lot of nerds. We got a lot. We're rich in nerds. I don't think I can claim that we have the plurality of nerds, but yeah, no. There's like one chaplaincy conversation I think that's happening around the trauma and loss of just like the awareness of what the world is going to look like for the people that come after us. Like sort of looking at like in the faces of my own kids and just being like, woof. If you're 5 now, it's going to be real dicey when you're an adult. That feels bad. It's hard to hold. And I feel like there's a lot of energy on that side of the chaplaincy. And the stuff that I'm really also focused on or more focused on is how can we sort of bring some of the, like, chaplaincy skills and whole person approach to also the people that are in the middle of it making these hard choices all the time?
Yes, right. There's the future casting, the loss that we know is coming, that is one of the focuses, and then there's the loss that is currently happening right now. One of the things that we've been talking about on the show is this idea of chaplaincy on the front lines. Any place that you are geographically is, if it has not yet become a front line, it will become a front line of climate change at some point. And you're being called into, right, into spaces where people they're in the frontline experience of active home and habitat loss. I really appreciate you naming what you've noticed about other people's inability to maybe have compassion or understanding for what is really land grief. It strikes me that it's only in a colonial context that we would be confused about why people would not want to leave their land. For hundreds of years into this steady narrative that it is not our way to be connected to land, but actually humans want to, and maybe in some ways our soul requires it to be connected to land, connected to place. And so the grief of loss of place it's one of the most profound griefs you can experience.
One of the things in disasters that people talk about is that we're going for helping people get back to safe, sanitary, and secure housing. That's one of our pat phrases. And one of our partners in Western North Carolina has articulated a super helpful extra frame that we've now been using, which is we want people to be in places that are safe, sanitary, secure, and chosen, not assigned, so that there's agency and choice rooted in the outcomes that people have in this coming upheaval caused by the climate crisis.
So your organization, Episcopal Relief and Development, has decided to shift, as I understand it, has decided to shift its U.S. disaster response strategy to focus pretty specifically on climate adaptation. And given what you just named, this safe, sanitary, secure, and chosen, these sound like some of the factors that you're thinking about. I imagine there's so much more than just logistics involved when you're relocating people or supporting people to relocate. There's values, theology, care, what is actually available, and
Mhm.
where are people going to be welcomed. I would love to hear your thoughts about accompanying people through this kind of upheaval and what you're learning, what your organization is learning.
If you, like, ask people after disaster who moved, like, raise your hand if you're a climate refugee, nobody's hand is gonna go up.
Mm,
And if you ask people, "Did you move because of this disaster, and do you acknowledge that this disaster was driven by the changing climate?" Lots of hands will go up.
because there are people out here who are like us in the discourse using climate refugee, but then the folks that we're talking about wouldn't use that language to describe themselves and in fact might react to it. There's a way to look at that and say it's semantics, but then there's another way to look at it and say language really matters here.
10,000,000 people are gonna be moving in the US in the next however many years. Again, that will happen, but
Yeah.
whether any of them say they're moving because of climate change is, like, a whole separate question.
Yeah. Yeah.
What we're working on right now is, like, how do we talk to folks, like regular people, about how to assess their own climate risk? Because we know it's not as simple as, like, coastal Louisiana equals high risk and inland Louisiana equals low risk. And so how can we figure out how to help people assess risk in ways that then make sense for them moving forward?
Nicole was sharing that at a recent BTS Center event, you said that the most important climate change related action a church in Maine could take was to work on affordable housing. Would you say that focus on housing is one of the most critical parts of the climate migration, climate adaptation work that you all are doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Let me connect those dots. Part of the reason I'm using climate mobility versus climate sort of migration or climate refugee is that it shows that it's, like, not unidirectional. It's not just that everybody is moving one time north.
Hmm.
Because what we know is that if millions of people are gonna be moving from these higher risk areas, many of which are in the South, but certainly not exclusively, we know that that will just drive prices even higher in the places that people are going.
Hmm.
As more people come, prices go up, and as prices go up, some people can't afford them, and then they move. You have what they're calling climate gentrification cycle. I see it here in Maine. People with resources, like from California, that don't wanna deal with fires anymore, take their remote jobs and move here to Maine,
Mm.
and then as prices go up, low-wage workers here are priced out.
Wow. So I remember in the early years of my career, when I was working in a disaster preparedness context, I remember having the kind of light bulb go off of, oh, there's a connection between the aftermath of a disaster and our capacity to reimagine the structures of society. And I remember at that time, anytime I tried to raise that question with anybody, it was just like it went
Yeah.
off, you know? No one wanted to be having that conversation. And I don't think I knew enough at that time to understand why. What was the sort of somatic or whatever resistance to that idea? Because to me it felt so like, wow, you know,
Yeah, obviously.
that's so exciting. Young anarchist, you know. But now I think I have more of a sense of the grief and the overwhelm that sets in for people, the powerlessness, the lack of agency, the feeling, the hopelessness, and the sense oftentimes that people have in the immediate aftermath. I'm lost in the storm. I just want to find a way back to what was. But I've never lost sight of this question of what if we can create a more just world? I'm thinking about this in terms of, okay, if we know what's coming and we know what's needed, then what is the role of faith community? What is the role of spiritual community? What is the role of networks of people who are not just morally engaged, but spiritually engaged in these questions, in fostering a more just world through the kinds of changes that we can make?
Two things come to mind. One is in our faith communities, when we've talked about climate, we often call it eco-justice in the Episcopal world. We're usually talking about what in climate world we would call mitigation activities. So we're putting solar panels on, we're adding an EV charger, we're putting more insulation, that kind of things to lessen the amount of carbon that's being emitted.
Hmm.
We're not usually having adaptation conversations. Even if we stopped emitting tomorrow, the world is still different in ways that we need to figure out how to adjust to. At our best, I think church is a great space for imagination, moral imagination.
Hmm.
If there's gonna be a place where we're dreaming about what a world could look like, that's often a faith or spiritual community. Because it's not just like me saying, "I think we need to do housing." If you can get your community around it, it's like we feel like God is calling us to a more just world, and that means more housing in our context.
Hmm.
We're not just, like, saying a little policy thing. There's a big amount of meaning behind it, and it ties to a much bigger story.
Hmm.
That's a huge piece that faith communities can do is be that imagination holders. Not that faith communities are the only place where we can imagine, but I think they're certainly a good one. And I think that one of the things our faith communities and spiritual spaces tend to be decent at is on our best day, we're good at welcome. In a world where we're talking about climate mobility, part of what we're recognizing is that it's not someone leaves and never goes back, but somebody might leave the coastal place after a disaster. They might bounce up to their sisters in another town, stay there for a little bit, and they go back to the coastal place, then they go back to their sisters, and then they go to some auntie's house. They're kind of like bouncing around. And in all those places, it would be great if they were welcomed so that that human longing to go home and to go to a place where you feel recognized and that you know that place. If that original home has been destroyed and that you won't be recognized there because it's not there, what would it be like if you were actually welcomed in a real way in other places, and how would that affect your heart? Again, I'm always very careful whether any particular person decides to go back to their home again, it's like their choice. That's their call with their own complicated reasons. But it's unfortunate if the reason that they're going back is that they weren't welcomed in the place they landed.
Hmm.
We can extend that hand, whatever choice that person ends up taking.
Wow. Hmm.
Hi there, it's Ophelia from the BTS Center. Did you know that our team puts together show notes and discussion questions for you for every episode? Climate Changed is for you and your spiritual community. You can find all this and more online at climatechangedpodcast.org. Now, back to the show.
These are really powerful, powerful invitations that you're making and powerful moments that you're pointing to. And I'm thinking about our listeners because I hear you talking about really shifting our thinking away from place-based recovery to a people and community focused sense of like we're focusing on the actual humans involved. The person who is like going to their sister's house and then going back and then going to their auntie's house and going back. I could just almost feel like this is a real person for you. You know what I mean? I'm sure you have so many stories, but for our listeners, I wonder if you could give us like just like a story from your work of one of these people or families that you've really witnessed through.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about what is mine to share.
Mm-hmm.
One really good example from the work that we've done in the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017. Our model is to partner with the Episcopal institutions in those places primarily because they have the networks. They know who has the 12-step groups and who has the ESL classes and food ministries and all that stuff. They have those networks of relationships.
Right.
So we worked with folks in Puerto Rico, in the Diocese of Puerto Rico, to do a ton of activities. But we also worked with priests in the Diocese of Central Florida, which is the Orlando area. A lot of people that had complex medical needs were being moved off island into the Orlando area because they couldn't get the health care they needed on island. These were not people that were making the choice. Who knows what their choice would have been? But they, because of the support they needed to be in this other community.
Mm.
And to me, what was really lovely was that that church had a network of immigrant grandmas, many of whom were Puerto Rican. There were abuelitas, and they basically just befriended, supported, and kind of harangued some of these, especially like young mothers that had high risk pregnancies and were staying in motels where it was like hard to like get the food you were needed to eat to take care of yourself. It was hard to like motivate yourself to like move because you were in a strip mall hotel in Central Florida. These ladies just welcomed. They welcomed in a deep way because they themselves had also been welcomed when they had landed or had not been welcomed. So they were like really aware of like what it was like to be a newcomer in a world where we know that people are going to need to be moving. And there's so much grief in that. The fact that there was an extended hand and support in the place that they were, even if it was brief, that then sticks with them and it sticks with the people that know them. So that if after another event, that person is displaced again, they don't only have warm feelings about being at home. They had a feeling of being welcomed in this other place, this other time. And then that becomes another thread that they can draw on in terms of their own resilience. Like I had support in my home community. I also had support in this other place. And so if I have to do it again, there could be support in that next place. As we're trying to imagine collectively, but also broaden people's imaginations on an individual level, because what we can dream for ourselves has so much to do with how it felt or didn't feel. Other times we've gone through similar situations.
Right. Right. Yeah, that is so real. This piece around your actual lived experiences can really expand or constrain what feels possible. Thank you for sharing that story. I want to zoom out a little bit. What is your assessment of the state of disaster response right now? You're working at multiple levels. I'm sure you're aware both nationally and internationally and what's happening inside of faith-based disaster response, but also what's happening inside of the secular institutions and organizations that are doing disaster response.
Yeah. In the US, which I think is the part I can speak to sort of with the most firm footing, we're so profoundly rooted in the place-based individual household kind of approach to disaster response. So much of how we all think about disaster recovery is about houses. How many houses did you rebuild last year? It's like a major metric within the sector. I know that my indicators are so like wishy-washy. Like how many families did you learn their dreams? How many of them did you help me? You know what I mean? Like, it's like so woo in some ways, but like, what are their recovery plans separate from the number of windows that need to be replaced? As Americans, we're often in a stance toward individual property ownership anyway. So much is like, what percentage of the property tax base in this particular town has like returned? And then what we're doing as a sector is trying to do the like kindest version of that. We know that what the town wants to do is return the property tax base. And so how can we help low and moderate income families also return to their houses? Because returning to their houses and restoring the property tax base is obviously the right answer. Part of the epiphany for me in working on this new strategy was that individual solutions don't work to these kind of collective problems. Helping one individual family put their house on stilts on some barrier island somewhere, if the road is flooded twice a day at high tides, it doesn't matter that much how elevated or not elevated that particular house is, unless that family wants to be boating around. The currency is still individual house by house by house by house. And so as a sector, what we're trying to wrap our minds around is, how do we break that cycle? And how much of us need to break that cycle to start making headway on breaking that cycle? What's nice right now is that we're realizing that there are small ways to be shifting how we intervene, and that even people that are still going to mostly be doing property restoration as their disaster recovery, there's still some space to try other things. What if we just like gave money to low income households impacted by disasters, especially if they're renters or mobile home owners who rent the lot? What if instead of outside volunteers, many of whom are white, rolling into an area helping to put the new roofing on, what if construction workers who live in that house help their auntie do it? What if we let them have the money to move to a different apartment?
Right.
And it does let then us find out, if you give a low income disaster impacted household $1,000, is their housing quality better? Where do they go? What happens? What we're finding is that it's not huge amounts of money to make some pretty consequential shifts in terms of people's housing quality. Sometimes those shifts in housing quality involve moving. Isn't that interesting? Because we know that mass human migrations throughout history tend to cause greater inequality. Therefore, we know that younger people and wealthier people go first. And I think that sometimes we can be really fatalistic about it. Like, oh, well, it's going to be the poor people and the old people left behind because they love it so much. Well, if you gave them a couple $1,000 and you find out that they move, it's probably not that they love it. It's that they didn't have support to make another choice. Again, it's not going to get anywhere close to evening the playing field, but offer that little boost to help people be able to have the kind of choices that people with more resources take for granted.
I want to circle back to this question around collective solutions and what collective solutions have to do with unlikely collaborators, especially within a U.S. individual property, nuclear family-based framework. There's already a constraint on imagination of what is possible if what we're trying to do is recover back to that as our steady state, which is arguably not a steady state.
It's never been a steady state, yeah.
State of separation and not intactness, right? We actually need collective solutions to collective problems. And that means there's some call to attention for our communities to say, we have to look at what's happening where we are, and we have to look at who can we be in conversation with, who can we be partnering with that is going to help us solve this problem, regardless of whether we would have thought of them as a partner or collaborator. And I remember you were saying at the top of the hour that when you went to New Orleans, you were getting to be in collaboration with lots of people with lots of different political stances and lots of different faith backgrounds who were all cohering around similar work. Where are you seeing that now, 20 years into the work in the field? Where are you seeing the collective solutions that are coming through these unlikely collaborations, or people finding unlikely collaborators, able to partner and collaborate across difference?
I wish I had a good answer. and I don't have an answer at all to this. Part of what's so hard is holding intention, the idea that we want collective solutions for collective problems and also individual agency. My family is from the Eastern Shore of Virginia. House is built on swamp. So the collective solution is gonna be that we're just gonna buy out an entire town and plunk them in the middle of Delaware. That would be a collective solution,
Mhm.
but, like, they didn't pick it. Even if the majority of landowners were to pick that, that doesn't mean it's necessarily the right choice for everybody. So, like, how do we hold those 2? I don't have a good option. I think the thing that I keep thinking about is what's on the menu. As long as the menu doesn't have very many choices, people don't have very many choices.
Mm.
If after a disaster comes, if the only things on the menu are repair your damaged home in this high hazard location where you can't insure it, or never own a home again and become a renter in some place that is unfamiliar,
Mm.
I think we all know which one we'd pick. How can we have more choices on the menu so that the collective solution can still be individually chosen? If we can have more housing available and a way to communicate risk that does not require having a master's degree in environmental science. To me, one of the big things that faith communities, regardless of location and regardless of what their perception is of the risk where they are, is helping to have more things on the menu.
Mm.
Are there ways that you could be supporting people who are displaced from other places? Are there ways you could be supporting people who are displaced from your place? What else could be an option? And then being super neutral about which option people take.
Hmm.
Because sometimes you, like, work really hard to be welcome, 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 and then people are like, "Eh, I don't like it here. This is this sucks." That's their choice, and that's, like, the whole point.
Right. The job of leadership, the job of spiritual leadership in faith communities to not take personally the choices that people make when you create room for them to make their own choice.
Yeah, totally. I took a whole class on, like, meaning of the word liberation. God bless seminary for what you get to spend time doing.
That's my dream.
Ugh, it was so fun. One of the thinkers talked about liberation as the freedom to actually make choices
Mhm.
that align with what that person actually wants, that works on an individual or on a collective level. I do think that a big part of spiritual leadership is, like, holding out. We need to expand the menu of choices, and we need to respect people's abilities to discern what their own liberation looks like. Your liberation doesn't look like mine, and mine doesn't look like somebody else's.
Mhm.
Great. That's what we want. Plurality is awesome.
Plurality is awesome. Right. Right. It is also a practice of liberation to be in a position of power to be able to manage the flow of resources and not use your own, like whatever your own beliefs and ideas are as the sort of the managing quotient inside of that flow.
Exactly.
Well, and speaking of like rank, power, and difference, you've spoken about the importance of centering people who have like intersecting identities that create different kinds of vulnerabilities in the context of disaster and climate change. As a queer person, speaking to a queer person, I'm just curious to know from your vantage point, what are some of the unique challenges and strengths for queer folks, for LGBTQ identified folks, both individuals, but also queer folks like building family in different ways who are inside of faith communities or also affected by faith based disaster work,
I think you were gonna say faith-based violence, which is also in the
which
mix.
is also in the mix, right?
Yeah.
What are the vulnerabilities for queer folks and queer families who are potentially having to rely on communities of faith to respond and care for them? And those are spaces where they've also experienced violence and harm or alienation. I'm just so curious to know what some of your experience has been with that.
Yeah. One of the things that I love about disasters is that people wanna get stuff done, and they wanna work with who wants to get stuff done. There have been multiple disasters that I've been involved with where some of the bigger organizations, often in coordination with government leaders, run a system that makes sense for, like, straight married people who have a lease in their own name.
Yeah. Right.
Their, like, business life and their family life and their professional, like, they all, like, line up in the way that makes sense to a government framework. Mm, and they're happy to tell everyone all of that. And then you've got all the other people who don't wanna walk in to the Baptist church and say who they live with and how many bedrooms are in their house and what their job is, because it's more complicated
Mhm.
and or would cause them harm, or they worry that it would. What disasters do is they turn the volume up in the system that already existed. A
Mm.
place that has struggled with welcome will often struggle more with welcome. There is a sort of magical early days of a disaster, but that doesn't last and the volume gets turned up. The other side of that is that groups that are welcoming often work together in ways that they haven't before. I'm thinking about a disaster response once where the Episcopal Church ended up working with the Jewish community, Unitarian group, and like a secular group of some sort, and they kind of ran the other shelter for the people who didn't want to be at the main shelter. And it
Mhm.
ended up being unmarried straight parents that wanted to be together as a family, ended up being queer families, ended up being just people who didn't feel comfortable in that space. Like, ended up being kind of a more motley crew of what we would call beneficiaries than we would have thought. It wasn't an all queer shelter, even though I think they thought they were gonna be an all queer shelter, and I kind of like
Mm.
that too.
Yeah.
Say, like, who feels othered by this system, like, look, a lot of
Turns
other
out
folks like, other folks roll in too. Again, I think in that case, it's also not like the people were sitting in the big shelter, sitting in the corner with, like, evil
right.
and you're like, "Ha-ha."
Who can I hurt today?
Exactly. They were able to share resources. They were able to convey care. If we have immigrant communities that don't feel safe in the big shelters that are officially listed, they're often able to get resources from those big shelters that are officially listed because those shelters know why those people aren't there. There is an awareness of the limitations in all of our systems and a desire to like work across those boundaries, even if they're not able to like actually blow up the boundary
Yeah.
2 days after the tornado or whatever. But after a disaster, everything is chaos anyway, and there just is an actual open-heartedness about sharing that isn't there all the time, and to me, that's
Yeah.
part of the, like, magic and the transformation that can happen if you're able to recognize that, like, sending sandwiches to the church across town that doesn't feel comfortable in your space, like, nothing bad happens when you do that. Actually, it's kinda great. The
Right.
likelihood that you can carry that with you afterward is just so much higher. I always think a lot about, like, myself as the Grinch, and, like, what we're trying to do is, like, have our little Grinchy hearts grow, like, one little size. I do think that our, like, little Grinchy hearts do grow when we can do something together that's outside of our comfort zone, and,
Mhm.
like, at the best, like, that's what disasters can be.
Oh, so real, right? It's literally dissolving the boundaries of what is known,
Yeah.
right?
If we, like, let our hearts grow a size and our imaginations grow a size, like, we can do a different thing. That is part of that transformation. Like, we have a
Mhm.
muscle to try a new thing and be changed by it.
Wow, that's so beautiful. What a beautiful place to begin our landing. I have one more question for you.
Is it about the Grinch? I hope it's about the Grinch.
I can find a Grinchy framing. We're asking all of our guests this season, what is a practical next step that a listener can take after hearing this conversation? Maybe the Grinchy framing is like, what is one small thing that someone could do that would help grow their heart a size?
Right, like, create the conditions where your heart could maybe grow a size.
Yeah.
I think one thing is to think about what the actual hazards are in your place. Like, what are the things that cause harm to people and people's living conditions and people's working conditions? They might not be the, like, big sexy ones that are on the news. It might not be giant earthquakes, but, like, what are the things that can happen
Mhm.
in your place? What are the gifts that you as a person, but especially you in the communities that you're in, could bring to bear in that kind of situation?
Right.
It doesn't have to be the things that would be on a, like, imaginary Red Cross checklist. Like, it's not just like, who has a generator? All kinds of different things. that people are a part of and the things that people do are able to be leveraged in the response to a disaster. So it could be that it's the youth group and the knitters and the people who usually make casseroles for the new babies in your faith community. You might have apartment fires that happen in your area, and
Mhm.
you might be able to bring some resources. What are these little ways that we can be involved in the everyday crises, knowing that's the muscle that we develop that then gives us the right stance and the right connections to be involved as bigger and bigger things happen. You get good at it, or it becomes a pattern and a culture in your place. That's the little Grinch heart setting that we need so that we're ready as things continue, because we know that what's a little bit of flooding now is gonna be a lot of bit of flooding. How can we be ready and also open-hearted to know that just because we responded with buckets this time doesn't mean we're gonna be responding with buckets for the next 25 years.
Right. Right. Wow. That's so helpful, Katie. Thank you so much. And thank you for this whole conversation. I've got so much of a download and I just learned so much from you. Thank you.
It was
Thank you
really
for
fun.
sharing your wisdom and experience and also your jokes
All the jokes.
all the
It was
time.
great. Thanks.
Thank you. Our guest today was Katie Mears. They are the Senior Technical Specialist for U.S. Disaster and Climate Risk at Episcopal Relief and Development.
You can learn more about the Episcopal Relief and Development at their website, Episcopal Relief.
Katie is also the co-author of Adaptation Through Shock, an article about how recovery after hurricanes Helene and Milton can support adaptation to new climate realities. You can read it on the Carnegie Endowment website, and we will have a link for you in the show notes.
Climate Changed is a podcast from the BTS Center in beautiful Portland, Maine. Our show is meticulously and lovingly produced by Peterson Toscano. Thank you, Peterson. You can find transcripts, discussion guides, and now full-length video episodes with bonus material on the BTS Center's YouTube page. Explore more about our in-person and online program offerings at the BTS Center. I would love to see you at one of those programs. Stay connected, share this episode, and reach out anytime. Autumn and I would love to hear from you.
And as we close, here's a blessing for today. May you feel the wind at your back, the ocean at your feet, as the hands of your ancestors, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly, guiding you into the future.
Love it. Thank you, Autumn.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you for joining us for this vital conversation with Katie Mears. There is still so much more to explore. So we are keeping this conversation going. Next week on Climate Changed, you will get to hear my conversation with Autumn as we unpack the profound themes and ideas that Katie raised today. We'll explore the realities of climate disaster response and share some concrete next steps you can take in your own life and community.
Coming up on the next episode of Climate Changed.
What if climate change is also an opportunity multiplier in the same way that a particular disaster might also come along with some opportunity?
It was kind of almost a throwaway line or an aside in the conversation, but there was a moment where Katie was like, yeah, and then don't make people feel like they have to accept your quilts every time something goes wrong. And I was like, that's it right there. The idea that because I'm offering it, you have to accept it and be grateful.
Disaster work isn't only about logistics. It's also about love. It's about seeing the divine in every person who has been forced to move, to rebuild, and to start again. Make sure you are subscribed to Climate Changed so you don't miss it. See you next week.